Dr. Doug Bolton, thanks so much for coming on the show today.
It's great to be here, and thanks so much for having me. I'm really honored to be here with you.
Oh my gosh. Well, of course, and I know I'm excited that we get to have this conversation as well. Ever since we had kind of a serendipitous meeting when we both were doing a presentation together. I feel like maybe it was about year and a half ago, and it
Yeah,
seems like we vibrate very much on the same wavelength around, at the very least, youth mental health, which is what we're here to
yeah,
talk about today.
yeah. I so enjoyed meeting you, and then on the panel discussion we were on, and then to have met afterwards and to find so many areas of commonality. And so it's been fun to learn from you and to hear about how you're extending your practice in so many interesting ways. And so it's fun to be here with you today.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, maybe you can get us started by talking a little bit about your background and how that's gotten you involved in the youth mental health movement and what your angle is on all of this right now.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't think I'd ever seen myself as an advocate for mental health. I've always been a clinician who's a little bit more focused on what's right in front of me and not so much about the broader issues. I spent most of early in my career. I spent time working with kids. I knew I wanted to work with kids, and then what I realized, I worked at a summer residential facility called Wadiko Children's Services in New Hampshire, and and it was a very intensive time. I'd never worked with kids with significant emotional and behavioral challenges before, with significant mental health issues, and all of a
Mm,
sudden, I realized within moments, it's like, oh, this is what I want to do. I'd been a little bit lost after college, and so I spent time in therapeutic schools and residential facilities. I realized I wanted to go to graduate school, and so I decided to get my PhD, and I got my PhD in clinical psychology, and then when I'm done with that, I had to figure out what do I want to do with this degree, and I think the thing that I realized was that the kids I was most drawn to working with, and the kids who I found myself feeling I could be most helpful with, were also the kids who need a lot more support than just 50 minutes one day a week. And I realized the places that have the greatest impact on kids' lives are often schools, and our
mm,
ability to build school communities that support kids. And so I started working in therapeutic schools, and I was a school psychologist, and then I became the principal at North Shore Academy. And it was during that time that it was probably 15 years ago when my boss, Heather Meal, said to me, um, we want to do a presentation to help other educators better understand mental health in kids. And I thought, oh my gosh, I'm not, I, you know, I know how to help individual kids. I know how to support a program and a building in supporting kids, but I don't know what to say about the overall mental health, how to frame that really important question and dialogue. And what and she so I said, well, do you want me to figure out poverty and world peace as well? And because that's really what it felt like for me. But as I dove
yeah.
into it and I started thinking about the mentors that I've had and the ways that people have thought about it, I realized I do have something that I could share with people. And so that led me to do additional talks and thinking, and to write a book about it. And my hope is that it can help frame a discussion about mental health that I think is dearly needed. And
Yeah.
if we don't begin changing our dialogue about this, I think it can have a real impact on
Hmm.
kids, not only now but also in the future.
Yeah, well, and I'd love to hear more about the book as we go along today. But what strikes me from what you've said so far has is moving from that focus on the individual when you were more in your therapist role into more of the system. And when you looked at the school environment and you said to yourself, okay, well, this is such a huge part, this community, the system of young people's lives, and they all come here, right? School is like that
Yeah.
touch point where
Yeah.
all the kids have their own ecosystems at home, which may be more or less healthy, and I'm sure we'll talk about that today too. But then they all come to the same place, and what if that
Yeah.
environment could be healing? What if that environment could be helpful?
Yeah. It's interesting. Schools are a captive audience for kids, um, and so the what we know is that our environment has a huge impact on how we act. Nicholas Christakis does a lot of work on this. He's from Yale, um, and what he found was that when you put kids in one environment, you put anybody in one environment, and they can do pretty well. But you put them in another environment that's more of a toxic environment, and we show up
Hmm.
differently. And the interesting thing is, if you take a look at the research on belonging, for instance, all the things that we're most worried about for our kids, whether it be, especially in schools, academic achievement, social skills and social development, attendance, academic engagement, mental health, physical health, all of these things are improved when kids feel and experience a sense of belonging. And then
Mm.
they've also done research on this with adolescents, and all adolescent risk factors, the things we're most concerned about: suicidality, violence, drug use, extreme emotional distress. All of these, they looked at thousands and thousands of adolescents and found that there are two protective factors, and that's their sense of belonging at home and at school. And so to
Mm.
me, the question is, how is that not where we start, right? I'm not saying that a community of belonging fixes all things that kids are struggling with, but I guess what I would say is that these are the thing that these are the outcomes we know. And how is
Yeah.
it that we're not focusing more and more on how to create communities, whether it be in kids' homes, and focusing on what is our community like at home before we start with the sticker charts or whatever else we want to do to change behavior. What
Yeah.
is our sense of belonging there? What is our sense of belonging on our teams? How can our coaches create these places of belonging? Because teams will perform better. So
Hmm.
so as I think about creating communities, the belonging research is really some of the most profound for me.
I bet. And something that strikes me as you talk about belonging is that this sounds like a very low cost sort of intervention. Like when you look at the data and you
Hmm.
say, okay, so we see there's this vulnerability in a good way for change around belonging. Like you can tweak the amount of belongingness and get this really positive result. We don't have to pour millions of dollars into like creating a program or hiring bunches of people. It has to do with the way we create the culture, whether or not we're
Yeah,
talking about at school or at home, and that does not have to be uh, very resource demanding. It just has to be very intentional.
yeah. Well, I love that you pulled that from this, because I think that's right. That we don't need. Um, what I would say is when there's a mental health crisis, we want to just hire more social workers. There's a public health parable that I like that you're probably familiar with, but there are two people are sitting by a river having a picnic. This is kind of my adaptation, right? And
Yeah, yeah,
and they look up and they see a child in the water drowning, coming down the river, and they dive in and they swim out and they get this child to safety, and they're exhausted, and they look up and there are two more kids, and they dive back in and they bring those kids out. And by the time they're completely exhausted and they look up, and the river now is filled with kids who need their help to survive. And one of the adults gets out of the water and goes up on shore, and the one in the water says, "What are you doing? I can't save these kids on my own." And the one on shore says, "I'm going upstream. We got to figure out why these kids are falling in."
yeah.
And I think that the thing that is happening is we become so focused on mental health problems really show up as behavior. That's how they end up in our therapy offices. That's how they end up receiving treatment. That's how they end up in the dean's office in schools. The behavior is always downstream. There's always something
Mm-hmm.
upstream, and upstream are things like real stress or discrimination or a history of trauma, social stresses, skill deficits, whatever they may be. The thing about downstream is it's like, oh, I can get this one kid out of the water right now. It's quick and it feels simple. Upstream
Mm-hmm.
solutions are more complicated and they take more time, but when we get it right, we can really help. And so my thing is that we've got schools and we've got teams. We want to be together, belonging. Whenever we
Yeah.
got families, we've got all the resources we need. Can we take the time? Can we be focused on understanding that when kids gather in a classroom, that there's power in their ability to connect in those classrooms that will help not only their mental health but also their their achievement, their ability to
Yeah.
develop self-regulation, all of these things.
Yeah, what strikes me about the story as well as the process of going upstream and the patience that that takes is that it really isn't a quick fix, right? When you pull someone out of the water, you get that immediate validation of I just saved
Yeah,
somebody's life, but it might be a process to stop the kids from falling in, and it can be difficult sometimes to stick with that process of say creating belonging or creating
yeah,
emotional safety when it doesn't already exist. It's not something where you can just go and flip a switch or give someone a massage and all of a sudden they're like, oh great, this is where I belong. I assume it would probably take to create that culture around someone. Probably, I'd say weeks or months, I'm guessing, to really shift a culture like that, if not longer. And that takes a lot of uh, perseverance. It takes a lot of sustained effort.
yeah. I do think it takes intentionality, and I think that there are structures that we can put into place that can be really helpful. You know, the thing that we often try and do is to say, okay, let's take a classroom for example. I'll do some belonging activities the first couple days of the year, and then we've got to dive into the academics, right? And it's not like belonging happens in 3 class periods.
Right.
Belonging is a developmental process, really, and it's not linear. There are times that we feel in any of our the communities we're a part of where we feel a sense of belonging, and times that we don't. But I do think that there are some things that we can do that can turn the dial in a way, in ways that we can structure ourselves so that we
Yeah.
can create these communities. And when I speak to schools, for instance, Bruce Perry talks about. I'm not sure if he refers to them as the 3 R's, but certainly, I do. So the 3 R's are: you've got to be emotionally regulated, you've got to be connected in relationship to access your best brains, right? So those are ways that, and so can we add those components into our classrooms? Can we add those components into our meetings? And it doesn't have
Mm.
to take very long. It can take 30 seconds to a minute of just quieting and noticing what's happening in your, in terms of your own emotional regulation. It
Yeah.
it can then be, can we share that? Can we make sure that that everybody in class, number one, has an opportunity to pause? We know how important pausing is. Mary Jo Barrett, a local clinician who's taught me a whole lot about this. She's really a leading voice in the trauma world, and what she says is, that we need to be able to pause and ponder in order to be able to access our best selves, and that there's a rhythm to this. And what
Yeah.
we know from research on the brain is that we all need to take some moments to pause and ponder. And so the challenge for us in schools as we continue, and at home, is we continue to add things to kids' lives whether it be add more and more learning targets into the classroom, add more travel teams to the parents are working harder than they've ever been before. We've got more parents with two jobs in the homes, and then we've got three kids each with two travel teams, and there's never this break. And what we know is that just pausing in schools, even for 30 seconds at the beginning of class and 30 seconds at the end of class, to just notice before I head out into the hallway, and as I'm coming in, just to notice what's happening, to be aware of my regulation. Is there an
Yeah.
opportunity then to connect with one another, to be able to say, this is how I'm feeling in this moment? Or you can do it around curriculum. But do we know
Hmm.
something a little bit more about one another by the end of each class? And so by incorporating some sort of regulation and some sort of connection and relationship building in every class, it costs maybe 2 to 3 minutes. And yet,
Yeah.
these are the things that we know help a sense of belonging. It quiets our nervous system so we can be more active and engaged academically. And that would be, these are some of the places where I would start, right? Is just to
Yeah.
embed some of these in every classroom.
So I'm wondering that what what the barrier is, because it seems like 2 to 3 minutes is very doable if we keep the scope to the school setting for a minute. Obviously, teachers have so much on their plate, on their plates right now. So I'd imagine maybe there would be some resistance there in terms of adding in another thing, but it seems also then that they'd be getting a lot out of the practice, that their students would be more regulated in class. It would create a culture in the room, perhaps, that would be more cohesive. I'm wondering, what are these factors, these pressures right now that are happening in school? It's moving those environments further away from belonging. And how do we get more buy-in for the type of model that you're talking about?
Yeah, I think my mind goes to a lot of different places with this. It's a great question. I think that if we go back to where, a lot of the research and data speaks to um, an intensifying of children's mental health problems. There's also been an ongoing and progressive teacher shortage. I think that our classrooms are no longer that healthy for our teachers either, or for administrators for that matter. When we take a look, for me, historically, one of the places where I look is the initiation of No Child Left Behind. And No Child Left Behind, certainly what we know is it didn't work in terms of getting academic achievement up in the way. In fact, more and more schools were failing to make progress as No Child Left Behind continued to kind of have roots in our school systems. But the thing that strikes me about No Child Left Behind is it really focused us on scores. It focused kids on scores. It focused teachers were being evaluated based on their scores. Schools were getting evaluated based on their scores. You'd get punished if your scores were low. Schools would get punished. Teachers would get punished based on their evaluation if scores were low. And so I think all of a sudden, and I think NCLB was a reflection of things that were happening before then. But in many ways, what ended up happening, I think, is we started focusing on data in a way that we had never focused on data before. And we took our eyes off of the people part of our work. And the thing that's ironic is that I'm not saying we shouldn't focus on data, but what we know is that a sense of belonging drives the data.
Hmm.
And so when we focus first on the data and we don't put the time into creating community, then we not only lose the community that's so supportive, not just academically, but also socially and emotionally. But we lose those test scores. There's oh gosh, I can't remember what effect it is. It'll come to me, but there's an author who has this effect. He says once you make a measure a target, it ceases to be a good measure. And so what
Mm.
happens is once we made test scores a target, then we began to focus on test scores and not the things that drive the test scores. And so all of a sudden, school boards were needing to get test scores up, putting pressure on administrators to get test scores up, putting pressure on teachers to get test scores up. And so all of a sudden, our focus on how can we fit as much as we can into a class period to get our numbers up, I think came at the cost of not just our academics, but also very much at the cost of kids' mental health and actually also teacher mental health,
Hmm.
teachers' ability to enjoy what they're doing. Because when we don't have a sense of connection and community, and we're just focusing on performance, academic performance,
Yeah.
we lose the things that really have not a sense of purpose, but also lose all of the benefits of connection that come with being in a room with one another for 6 hours a day.
Yeah. So what I think I'm hearing you say is that progress is going to require a bit of a leap of faith, where we're so used to thinking, the path to success for the school are high test scores, or for my child, they've got to take all the AP classes, they have to have the highest GPA because college is so competitive, and all those sorts of things. Um, it's not you're not saying that the scores don't matter. You're saying that we're trying to get at those scores in the wrong way, and that if we, instead of trying to go just at the content, instead try to really address and nurture and cultivate the person, even if that feels risky here at the front end, it will
Yeah.
pay off if we stick with it.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. Yes, I think that these are some of the shifts we need to make, but it's not just in schools, because as parents, we started looking at test scores, and you raise a really good point that I think that there are a lot of myths that we embrace as a society. Um, and at some level, there's this belief that we need to make a lot of money to be happy. In order to make a lot of money, you've got to have a powerful and prestigious job. In order to get a powerful and prestigious job, you need to go to an elite college. In order to go to an elite college, you need to excel at everything and get into all the AP classes and everything else. In order to do
Yeah.
that, you've got to be in a very, very high intensity, accelerated academic program. In order to do that, you've got to start your kids off in a high achieving preschool so that they can be ready to go. And then in order to do that, you've got to do all these enrichment activities as infants, right? For me, way back in the day, it was baby Einstein. That was the idea, right? And the thing
Yeah.
is that these myths fall apart right at the very top. That there's this belief that we need more money in order to be happy. And what we know is that once our basic needs are met, um, the drivers of happiness, and it's for a family of four, I think it's somewhere between $75,000 and $100,000. Still a lot of money, but at
Yeah.
some level, what they say is it doesn't matter if you're making $100,000, $1,000,000, or $10 million. Your happiness won't change. And then if we
Mm.
take a look, and in fact, what we know about people's satisfaction at work and their health at work, it's much more about your engagement and about the community you're in as opposed to how much money you're making. And when we
Yeah.
take a look at elite colleges, the data doesn't support that. If you go to an elite college, you'll make more money. If you go to an elite college, you'll learn more. You know what they found,
Mm.
that regardless of what school you go to, there's one factor that determines how much you learn, how much you study, right? And so if you
That seems
study at
like
a state,
too obvious. That
too
seems too
obvious,
obvious. Yeah.
right? But
Yeah.
what they found is it doesn't
Yeah.
matter. If you go to a Harvard or if you go to Western Illinois, you're going to
Yeah.
learn either way if you study. And that in fact, 10 years after graduating from elite schools, people who attend those schools are generally less happy at work than people who don't. And so these are
Mm.
some of the ways that I think that we buy into this as parents and as educators, as community members. And so
Yeah.
when we have these beliefs that are leading us in, it leads us to put additional pressure on our kids because we're afraid they won't get into the elite college. We put pressure on our educators, all for in these reasons that really create a focus on achievement as opposed to engagement. Um,
Hmm.
I'm sure you've heard of the hedonic treadmill. This idea that
Not in that way. Could you explain? And our
yeah,
listeners might not have either. So
right. So the hedonic treadmill is really speaks to the idea that when we focus um, on achievement, the hedonic treadmill, the idea is we keep running and we run harder and harder, but we really don't get anywhere. And so what we know
hmm.
is that we'll get a if we focus on when we focus on numbers, when we focus on achievement, when we focus on getting um, into the elite college, these things give us an initial boost of happiness and joy. When we get a, a bonus at work, when we get a promotion, and what happens is our bodies are very quick to adjust to that. Our happiness levels are very quick to adjust to that. So yes, we get a bump, but then we quickly go back down to baseline. And so there's
Yeah.
almost, they call it an achievement addiction, where you continue to look for that bump through more achievement. But what ends up happening is you're never done, right? If you need to get into AP classes, and then you've got to get fives on the AP classes, then you've got to get into the elite college, and then you've got to be summa cum laude at the elite college, and then you've got to get into the best graduate school, and then you've got to get the best residency,
Yeah.
right? And then you've got to get then you've got to be the head of the department, and then you've got to get into the best hospital, and it never really ends. And that's the challenge. And our happiness, we think that this is going to be the key to happiness, but it's not. There's a saying that it's like being in a pie eating contest, and the prize is more pie, right? That, oh, so I
Yeah.
got that
Yeah.
promotion, but now there's this next stressful hurdle. And in the meantime,
Hmm.
we end up seeing great costs to our mental health. We see divorces, we see substance use, we see alienation from our kids alienated from us. And in a lot
Yeah.
of ways, kids then, I think, if you, there are kids who can keep up, and I think it's unhealthy for them. And in fact, one of the things that they found is that in 2019, the Robert Wood Johnson named um, excessive pressure to excel as just as much a risk factor as poverty, trauma, and discrimination in terms of mental health in kids. And so these
Yeah.
are the costs of creating of these myths that I think continue to drive us.
Yeah. It's this. If you wire somebody to feel like the pursuit of more or feeling a lack is the actual goal, then you've put someone in a situation where they can never actually achieve contentness. I know
Yeah,
that just in the therapy room is something that we often talk a lot about, is this idea of, well, like, is there actually a goal line when someone says feeling that if they have low self-esteem or if they feel like they're failing, not living up to, it's like, okay, so what would need to happen for you to feel okay about yourself? And when folks really drill into it, a lot of times they realize, well, I I, I don't know if it's possible given the way I'm
yeah,
currently thinking about what would what would make me feel like I'm an okay person, because
yeah,
there's always this idea of, well, I could be making more money, I could have that higher position, like you were saying. There's that this needing to be more than it is right now. Yes.
yeah. It's interesting. I love the metaphor you used of I feel like we continue to move the goalposts, right?
Yeah.
And one of the things that I think has happened with NCLB, one of the reasons why I think that we're struggling more, is we've got higher and higher expectations for our kids. More and more, I think that what they're asking kids to do in ninth grade is what I was having to do in 11th and 12th grade.
Mm,
And what we know is that when kids are stressed, stress comes from an incompatibility between my skills and what I'm being asked to do. And when you put,
mm,
if you take a look at a typical bell curve, you're going to have about 15% of the kids who are going to struggle. If you're kind of with whatever it is that we're doing, you're going to have 15% of the kids who are going to be a standard deviation ahead of everybody else. But what ends up happening when we begin to move the goalposts is we've got more and more kids. When we continue to push it, kids' brains aren't developing any quicker than they were 40 years ago, and we're putting
yeah.
more pressure on those brains. And we're going to have more and more kids who are going to fall behind because the kids who are able to do it are caught up in
Mm,
working so hard to stay ahead, and they've got the anxiety of failure. And then you've got other kids, more and more kids, who just can't keep up because the expectations don't match where they're at developmentally. The organizational expectations to
right.
be on several teams and to be able to manage more complex homework assignments, and so we're asking more of kids, and kids' brains haven't changed. Another statistic that I think is interesting is that the kids were getting an hour more sleep in 1980 than they were in 2010, and I would guess that trend is probably continuing to get worse. And if you just take a look at the mental health, all the impacts, whether obesity, symptoms of ADHD, um, um, behavioral issues, social skills, one
Yeah.
hour makes a huge difference. And so we've got a whole generation of kids that are getting an hour less sleep than generations before. And I think these are little
Mm,
things that add up, but it all comes from the same source, which is our real anxiety that our kids are somehow going to fall behind or going to lose out on this on
yeah.
this magic ticket to success.
Right. Well, and it's this question in some ways, not to get super existential about it, but like, what's it all about really? What really matters? And there
Yeah,
oftentimes is this view of either that prestigious job or lots of money, but at what cost, right? Both in
yeah,
terms of the adult who's perhaps pursuing those lofty goals, but also in terms of the developmental path that the kids go down to theoretically get there. I know for me, and I'd love to get your opinion about this, one of the aspects that's so concerning to me is when you look at the statistics and how, right now, the most recent data we have says that 1 in 5 kids has had suicidal ideation in the last year, 1 in 5 teens. And
yeah,
1 in 10 teens has attempted, which is also shockingly high, that 1 in 5 teens has a clinically relevant amount of anxiety. When
yeah,
I look at that and I think, okay, so then how does that project out over the next 10 years, particularly given that for many of them, those conditions may worsen or stay the
yeah,
same unless there's some sort of
yeah,
intervention.
yeah.
Um, the sorts of adults that they grow up to be, how more entrenched those problems get to be. Um, it really seems to me that the system's going to fall apart, or I don't want to be catastrophic about it, but even the fabric of our society is going to get very strained as folks who are struggling continue to struggle more as time passes.
Yeah, no, I think that this is one of my real worries too, is that the unprecedented nature of this, and it seems to be snowballing it in ways that are really concerning to me. There's an interesting, there's a part of me that wishes this was cyclical, because then at some level, I'd feel like, oh, it's going to get better. I think that it can get
Mm.
better. My hope is that we will reach a turning point where it does get better. But one of my, I think that there were several events that may be contributing to what's happening that, for me at least, puts this into a context. I think existentially, I appreciate You're referencing that because I think existentially this is a time of it's been a very hard 25 years.
Mm.
I think starting with 9/11, where all of a sudden we saw ourselves as at risk existentially in a way that we never had been, that vulnerable to attack. And then um, there was the financial crisis in 2008, which meant that we are really at risk financially. And then COVID came, and all of a sudden our health was we could not take our collective health. We're vulnerable all of a sudden to a pandemic in a way we had never been. And so all of a sudden we were vulnerable to outside attack, vulnerable to financial collapse, vulnerable to a pandemic. And the as the income inequity continues to drive a wedge, I think what it means, it feels like, oh, if we don't achieve, if we don't I think the
Mm.
risks feel higher for us. I think we're a traumatized nation in a lot of ways, which makes our thinking a lot more rigid, which makes us much more anxious and vigilant about things that could go wrong. And I
So
think we
achievement feels like something you can control, basically. Like I could do this and try to make my life better.
That's right. That's right. And this is and I think we all see this as the driver for
Mm.
success, is this idea of achievement, and then our teachers are responsible
Yeah.
for driving that. And it's academic success, it's getting onto the travel team, it's there's fierce competition everywhere kids look. And I think competition can be a good thing, don't get me wrong, in doses. It can help us
Yeah.
be our best, but it also, instead of creating community, it can really be divisive. And when we're in a winner take all situation, it's really problematic.
Yeah. So we're getting to the tail end of our chat today, and I always like to get to the part where we can have the rubber meet the road, where knowledge can turn into action. Because I think
Yeah,
that's the real power of knowledge, where you can use it to make something real or to do something differently and positively impact folks' lives. So for folks who are listening to the podcast today, what would you say are the action items or the places where we can potentially make a difference in the lives either of our own kids or the young people who were around, whether or not we're within a school? I think certainly there are going to be some listeners who are in that environment, but a lot of us who
yeah,
care a tremendous amount about this who are not. So
yeah,
what can we do?
yeah. I think that there are. I think I would focus first on embedding ourselves and our kids in communities that are healthy, communities that are vibrant. And we all know, we've all been a part of communities where we've thrived, and we've all been a part of communities that have been more toxic for us, and those are just unhealthy. And so I would do kind of an inventory of the communities that we're a part of. There's so much research, and certainly our Surgeon General is telling this story, and the Grant study is telling this story about just how important it is for us to connect. I would say as families, and so I would make sure that there are times in my day, if just as an individual, that I'm connecting, that I am pausing that I get a rhythm of pausing in and out of my day to make sure. And I think mindfulness practices are wonderful about that. But if you don't feel comfortable with that, just making sure that you are, it doesn't have to be a long time, but these moments of allowing ourselves to recover. I think I take a look
Mm-hmm.
at our families. There's great research on family dinners,
Mm.
empathy, academic achievement, social skills, all go way up. And things like early sexual behavior in kids, and suicidality, and many other factors plummet in families where there are
Mm.
family dinners. Now, I don't think that it's not about the broccoli, right? It's about the fact, and if you've got a family where you've got a parent who's working two jobs. It doesn't have to be dinner, but are there times when we are spending time connecting, really seeing one
Mm.
another, hearing one another's stories, knowing one another? And I think that for kids, if they are, uh, people would say, well, what if my kid wants to play 3-on-3 travel teams? Well, what do I say about that? And I said, well, what would you say if, I mean, the travel teams are good, sports are good. Um, ice cream sundaes are good. Would you give your kid, if they wanted 3 ice cream sundaes, would you say, oh, yeah, take 3, 4 if you can fit it? No, we probably wouldn't do that. So being able to say no to things that our
Mm.
kids might want because it's not healthy for them is not new to us. And I
Yeah.
guess I would make sure that as a parent I am regulated and I'm not feeling too stressed trying to get every kid to every practice and every orchestra and every martial arts training. Um, do I have time to rest and relax, and can I model that for my kids? And I guess that's the last thing is
Mm.
our kids are watching, and um, I like what James Baldwin said is that children have never been very good at listening to their elders, but they've never failed to imitate them.
Mm.
And so I think it starts with us, and can we begin being the models for our kids of taking time, of making sure we're carving out time for relationship, both in the family and also to sustain ourselves outside of the family, that we are living a life that's a manageable and reasonable life. But those are the things
Mm.
that I would start with, that we make sure that we're taking time to, as Bruce Perry would say, to regulate and relate. And that way we can access our best brains and our best selves.
Yeah. I like that. Regulate. Did you say there were three R's or two? Is it
Yeah, the
regulate and
third the
relate or?
third is the reason. So, but in order
Ah.
to get to reason, you can't,
Ah.
if you're
Okay.
not connected
Yeah.
in relationship, um, it's
Mm.
harder for us to find our best brains. If we're not regulated, we can't access our best brains. And what we also
Yeah.
know is that relationships help us regulate. And so that these
Yeah.
things are all deeply connected. But if we don't start with regulating and being connected in relationship, then we can't access our best social
Mm.
skills. We can't access our best problem solving skills. And so, can we start
Yeah.
there?
I really like that because I feel like some of the axioms in life, like they don't have to be that complex, and when you hear it, it rings true, but it's not necessarily what you'd think unless you heard it. And I think
Yeah,
that for all of us, like if we really reflect on it, yeah, if when we think about like why am I so stressed right now, it's usually some combination of the fact that something's up with your interpersonal relationships and something's up with your inner world where things are
yeah,
not regulated. And it stands to reason that the same thing would be true for our kids, that if we can create an environment where they can regulate, where they can relate, that gives them the foundation for everything else. And maybe that looks different in different cultures and different families, but it's achievable for everyone. And probably if we all take a second to think, we can really see like, okay, where are those points where we could enhance that in the life of our family.
I love so this is really the core of my beliefs about mental health that you just summarized so well. That when kids are struggling, they don't come into therapy unless there's problems with their relationships or their ability to be emotionally regulated. Those are the two things that bring folks into therapy, really, and they tend to go
Yeah.
together. And the thing about trauma is trauma disrupts both our ability to be emotionally regulated and to trust in relationships. And the thing that I
Yeah.
love is that community, when you take a look at the research on all three of these things, a connected and regulated community helps us learn how to connect, how to
Yeah.
build those relationships. It embeds us in, we're embedded in places where there are relationships. A connected and regulated community is naturally regulating for us. So we learn how to regulate, but we also spend more time regulated. We also know
Yeah.
that it can reverse the impact of trauma. And so I think conceptually it's quite simple, right? Let's build communities that are regulated and connected in relationship. And we can help kids. We know the risks of kids who, if you don't know how to, if you're not able to build strong attachments, it has huge health and mental health outcomes later on. The same thing
Yeah.
with emotional regulation, the same thing with trauma. And so it all comes down to being embedded in communities, because communities hit all of those. And for those who that doesn't work, you need more, that's when we as clinicians can come in and really help out, right? The ones who still fall into
Yeah.
the river, we still need people to jump in and help them. Um,
Yeah.
but as you also know, as clinicians, it's overwhelming. The demand is overwhelming, and people can't find that help. There aren't enough adults to jump in the river to get the kids out. And so I think we need to
Right.
go upstream. That's our work.
Right. Right. We've got to equip parents, communities, schools to within each of those environments help in whatever way they can, because from a professional standpoint, there's nowhere near, not even close enough of us to all jump in the river ourselves.
Exactly.
But on that note, and before I let you go, tell us a little bit about what's coming in terms of the book, because I know I really appreciated our conversation today. I feel like I've learned a tremendous amount about connection, about belonging, how this all fits together with schools. If folks want to learn more, what should they know about your upcoming book? How should they find out more to learn more from you?
Yeah. So people can just reach out. I'm at Formative Psychological Services. So that's fpschicago.com. The book is really exciting. I started writing a book thinking I was never going to. I just thinking no one would ever read it, but I just felt it was a book that needed to be written. And one of the things that I really want to give a very special person a shout out, and that, Aaron, is your mom, because there's a story here
Yeah.
that after you and I spoke after our panel discussion, I told you that I was writing a book, and I was just kind of finishing it up, and you said, "Well, my mom writes books about similar topics, about especially she'd helped co-write a book on emotional regulation called Self Reg with Stuart Shanker." And that was one of the books that taught me the most. So that was kind of amazing. And she agreed to look at my book. And I remember asking her, "Is this a book?" And she says it is a book. And she really helped hold my hand and help me get through the process to where I was able to get a publisher, an agent, and a publisher. And that's all due to your mom. So first of all, Self Reg is an amazing book. If you want to learn about regulation, that's the go-to book. And I'm so grateful to you and your mom for helping make this book something that I hope will be helpful to others. But really, it's about what we just talked about. Is it really
Hmm.
dives into the impact of attachment, and in particular insecure attachment, on kids, and how do we build community focusing on attachment, um, and then how do we understand regulation and emotional regulation? How do we understand trauma, and how do we build communities that will support the development for kids of their ability to make healthy, strong relationships, their ability to self-regulate, and in doing so, to be able to manage the impact of trauma. And so
Yeah.
I'm really excited about it. It comes out in probably in a little bit more than a year, early in 2025.
All right. Well, we will keep our eye out for that, even though it is a little bit down the line. Maybe we'll have you back on for another podcast when we get
I'm in.
closer. And it
Yeah.
was a pleasure to make that connection. I also happen to think the world of my mom. I think she's absolutely amazing. And I was like, oh, a psychologist writing a book. I know someone you should probably you should probably talk with. But Doug, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. It was a pleasure talking with you. Any parting thoughts for our listeners?
No, I guess I just want to express my gratitude for being able to be on here, and it's been wonderful to speak with you. You've got such a broad understanding of this work, and to help lead a discussion in the way that you did was wonderful. But also, I love following all of the work that you're doing and all the contributions you're making. So I guess I just want to share my gratitude to you for this time, and for really leading a discussion that I'm passionate about, and leading it so gracefully.
Oh, well, thank you. That's incredibly kind. Appreciate it. And thanks again for coming on.
Thanks so much.